Hey, Rusty, how are you?
Good. How's it going today?
Not bad at all. Not bad at all. How about yourself?
Doing fantastic. Up here in upstate New York right now, just at the base of the Catskills. Whereabouts are you in Houston now or New York?
No, I'm in New York also. I'm in the city.
Oh, great.
In fact, I have a young dog, so the back door is open a crack there. So you might hear a little bit of the sirens or something from the big city
It's the beautiful
here.
ambiance.
Yeah, indeed. What is that interesting coat that I see there over your left shoulder?
This here was a wedding dress, an Apache wedding dress. And
Fantastic. That's so cool.
yeah, and it's totally handmade. Even you can see the leggings are all hand beaded.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a real beautiful piece. My like adopted brother was a full-blood Apache off of the Mescalero reservation. He handmade that. They're so
very
heavy
cool.
for the height
Yeah,
that a girl for the height of the girl that would fit that. I think it'd just drag her down.
yeah.
Well,
Excellent.
congratulations on the presidency of the Explorers Club.
Well, thank you very kindly. And as I mentioned to you in the email too, the Da
Yes,
Vinci symbolism, has been popular in my household for literally generations. So
that
yeah.
that is fantastic, man. What a coincidence. And speaking of the generations, you had a pretty unique childhood. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, in fact, well, if you're, of course, every kid I think grows up believing that their childhood is normal, and so
Hmm.
it wasn't until I went off to college that I realized mine was not. I grew up with a astronaut as a father, and my mother was a professional artist, and so from my dad I got a lot of high tech and science interests. From my mom I got both art as well as an appreciation for nature and the natural world, you might say, and
Hmm.
observation, and that combined to lead me into my first career, which I think is the quintessential connection of high tech and art, which is computer games. I'm one of the very first ever developers of computer games. So,
Right.
but I can really take that back to the projects I did, even from when I was a kid. In fact, over on this side of me, I have a case of my science fair trophies. I was a terrible student,
Uh-huh.
but I was really good at science fair. So and that was sort of my chance to go study something that I was interested in personally and tell stories about it, which
Hmm.
is kind of still what I do today.
I read that in your neighborhood, you mentioned that really was the children of the neighborhood. They're either children of farmers or the children of engineers for NASA. Was there
Yeah, that's
was there like a class system there, or was it just kids being kids and wanting to play together, and it didn't matter if you were the
didn't
farmer or the astronaut? That's
matter.
beautiful.
Yeah, no, in fact, literally my right hand neighbor was Joe Engel, another astronaut. Left hand neighbor, Hoot Gibson, another astronaut. Over the back fence, we had three neighbors, one of whom was an astronaut. And we lived only 3 blocks outside the front gates of NASA, and so that's why everybody in my immediate neighbors
Hmm.
were all either astronauts or engineers. But
Hmm.
at the public high school that I attended, which was kind of the same distance but the other direction, half of them came from the NASA side of the school and half of them came from the agricultural side of the school. And so literally, 4-H and people raising their calves and going to rodeos and all that kind of stuff was just as common as people sending people to space. In fact, like the Houston Astros and all that kind of stuff, everything around there was sort of this weird hybrid of cattle, farming, and spaceships. And but no, as a kid, you just think it's all just part of those. That's just what reality is. That's your total
Yeah.
worldview. Is your little microcosm.
No, that was a great mix though, because you got the grounding part of it, no pun intended, but then the scientific part of it as well.
Yeah, and I think also, I think modern kids, or back in my day, or at least when I went to college, it was easy for people to fall into cliques or factions. The
Hmm.
nerds versus the jocks versus the whatever else.
Yeah.
In this case, anyone that actually works the land obviously has an appreciation for the land itself.
Hmm.
And my mother, as an artist, also had an appreciation for the woods and land and birds and the nature, the natural aspects of the sciences also. And so And even for my dad as an astronaut, a huge amount of what they were doing in space at that time, and frankly still now, is Earth observations. Looking for how is the planet changing, where's the water, where do crops grow, why is desertification happening, what's happening with pollution, all the same sort of things that anybody that's going to work the land on a local level is also thinking about. So it all seemed to integrate pretty well even at a young age.
Wow, that's great. Now, many know you're a pioneer of video gaming, but that started out really young.
Yeah, in fact, it was right as I got into I was exposed to it even a little bit before high school, or right about the beginning of high school. And the school that I attended, I spent all 13 years of grade school in the same physical school system, except 1 year, and that was my freshman year in high school, where my dad went back to Stanford University, where he'd been a professor, to take some updated classes in something that was relevant for him at NASA. And that school was one of the first ever to have a couple of computers in it. And then by the time I got back to my main school district, it also had acquired some computers. And so I took a summer program that same period of time that was about, ostensibly was about math, but it also included computers. And so I did what a lot of, I was not only fascinated by them, but a lot of kids my age at that time in the middle of the 1970s, since there weren't really, the teachers in the schools didn't know how to teach about these machines because they were literally brand new. Right. And so what you would do is you'd pull out a computer magazine, and there would often be like a program you could type in. So it'd be like, hey, if you want to, have a recipe card file, type in these 50 lines of basic code or something. And so I would type those in. And when you type in a program from a magazine, it often doesn't work because either it's written for a different machine, or you make a typo, or the person putting it in the magazine makes a typo. And so you have to debug it. And by debugging it, by typing it in and debugging it, you sort of learn the programming language. And then you learn to go like, oh, well, I can hold an array with this one. I can sort things with that one. I can draw something with that one. Let's put them together. And now I can make a little Dungeons and Dragons kind of game or something. You sort of just start assembling the pieces on your own, which is how I got in.
I laugh when you say that because it's exactly what I did. I had the computer magazine, and there was, I even forget the game, and it was just pages of code. And I had my my Commodore VIC-20, and I sat there. I remember I was homesick one day, and I was like, "What can I do?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm going to build this game." I literally coded that for 10 hours, and it didn't work. I'm sure it was a typo on my end, man, but the hours I put into that.
But that's it. That's the way you go. And obviously back in those days, there weren't good editors for art itself, or even the code itself back in those days either, like there are now. And so so you're really sort of learning everything at once, as you type in these in this code. It was really the only way back in the day.
Wow. Now, you pioneered really the 3D aspect of gaming back then. Was your mother a big influence on that, being an artist?
Absolutely. In fact, I left it downstairs, but there are very few games that predate me, but one of them that a friend of mine just found a copy and sent to me. So I have my first actual modern, copy that I've had since I was a kid, was a game called Escape. And it was a game using the Apple II's low-res blocky graphics. And the entire game was, you start with a top-down view of what's going to be a maze, and a maze would be dug into this scene above you. So it was like tunneling around on the screen to make a maze. And the first thing I thought was cool about that is the process by which to make a one solution maze, which I had not thought about previously, became obvious by watching it make a maze. Then it would put you into sort of 3D and let you find your way out of the maze. So it would just drop you in the maze, and your goal was to get out of the maze. And that's all it was wander and get out of the hallways. And it was low res graphics. It was 3D, but it was sort of, very coarse, you might say 3D. But I had already written a few of these top down games on a teletype. and I had just gotten this Apple II and saw this one of the very first games out called Escape. And I said, wait a minute, I can take these role-playing games that I'm enjoying, both on pen and paper and writing on a computer. I can create, perspective view in high resolution on this machine, and I can make a really cool game. But I didn't know perspective, and I didn't know the math for it, didn't know the geometry for it, nothing. And so I sat down with my mother, and my mother literally sat down with a piece of paper and said, let me show you how to draw perspective. He said, here's the horizon line, and here's a road that would meet at infinity and make a point. And if you do telephone poles along the sides, that how you go from one telephone pole through to make the ground for the next one, and there's a zigzag pattern you can make to determine the distance and heights of all those poles as it goes back. And so I went, okay, wait a minute, I can do that on the screen. And I worked out the little trigonometry, a couple sines and cosines that I thought I remembered from high school. I took my equations to my dad, and I said, Dad, before I do a lot of programming around this equation, did I get it right? And my dad used an entire other method to do the same calculations, but came up with the same results. So I thought, all right, I'm on it. And then I wrote these, it was written in BASIC. And so it's an incredibly long string of mathematical symbols to determine one point in this in this scene. And so it was also very slow because of just how much math I was having this tiny little 1 megahertz machine doing. But you could actually then watch it kind of draw in the depths of the scene as you run it. So I wrote that game, and this is again before I'd ever published anything. And I'd written a bunch of these text-based ones previously, just on a teletype that no one even owned a teletype, right? Only schools and universities had them. You couldn't have sold a copy to anyone, even if that ever crossed my mind.
Right.
But this game that I wrote on the Apple, I had a summer job at a computer store, and it was the owner of the computer store, a guy named John Mayer, who was looking at this game that I was showing off to my friends in the back of the store. And he was like, Richard, that game is way better than the simple word processors and recipe card file things and this checkbook balancing software. That's much more interesting than the other stuff that we're pretending that people need to buy a $3,000 computer in order to be able to own one at home. And so it was him that convinced me to spend what I thought was an enormous amount of money, all $200 of my life savings on Ziploc bags, Xerox cover sheets, and started hand copying discs. And then it took off from there.
Wow, that's amazing. And was that one of the Ultimas, or what was the title of the first one?
That first one, it really isn't. It's Ultima Zero, really, but I didn't call it Ultima. It was called Akalabeth. But it really was. In fact, when I did, as soon as that sold, I went, wow, if I can make money at this, I had to take this simple little game that has no story and sort of no point to it. I should wrapper it with a bigger experience and make a much better game. And I started the first Ultima, and so Akalabeth is actually a subroutine inside of the first Ultima. And but Akalabeth sold 30,000 copies or so, and my royalties was about $5 a piece. And if you do that math, that's $150,000 that I earned for my after school time in high school. And that was like, I was like, okay, maybe I should make another. And and then Ultima 1 sold 100,000 copies, and Ultima 2 sold 250,000 copies, and continued on up from there.
Now Ultima 3, there was a little difference in that, on where did you come up with the idea that not everybody wanted to play the good guy in video games? And
well, no, so here's how that happened. So Akalabeth and Ultima 1 was sold through a distributor in California. And so if anybody ever wrote in about whether they liked the game or not, I never heard from them, right? And those letters went to that company, and I never saw them. All I knew about what people liked about it was the check that I would get at the end of the month. I was like, all right, people apparently like it. I got a nice check. And then Ultima 2 came out through another publisher, but same thing. People wrote in, it would go to that company. Ultima 3 was the first time that we decided, my brother and I went into business together to manage the titles ourselves. And so that meant that when somebody finished the game, and at the end of the game, I always had a thing that says, hey, when you finish the game, write to Lord British and tell him you finished it, because I was just curious. And what I found was that people would write in saying things like, hey, I really loved your game. By the way, here's my things that you should change to make the next game better. So everyone's a critic. It's usually one paragraph of I liked your game and then pages of let me be a critic. But another thing that was obvious is that people would describe what they thought was fun about the game. And pretty much universally, people were having fun by killing all the NPCs in the game. They weren't, killing the bad guy, the main character was usually a bad guy that was waiting for them at the end. But along the way, they weren't actually acting very virtuous. They were min-maxing the way to get strong enough to win. And that usually meant steal from every shop and kill every character. And I hadn't really thought about the fact that I had created a game where the min-max way to win the fastest is to not be the good guy. And because I just assumed people would be the good guy. And so that's when I sat back and said, okay, I'm going to change the game. I'm going to make Ultima 4 to where you have to be the good guy. I'm going to let you try to be the bad guy, but I'm going to show you the real world response to bad behavior. So if you steal from a shop, that shopkeeper is not going to help you later on to give you the clues you need to win, because they're going to think you're a bad guy, which you are. And so I put all these moral tests throughout the game. And while I was building it, my family, literally my family, who were my business partners and investors, they were going like, Richard, this is a terrible idea, because people have just told you what they like doing to play your games. And you are now creating a game where you're going to punish them for doing the thing that they're enjoying. And I was like, yep, that's what I'm going to do. And so they literally, the advice of everybody around me was it was a terrible mistake. The results, however, was that Ultima 4 became the first #1 best-selling game that I had released. So it sold far more than any of its predecessors. It put the word avatar on the map as now the standard lexicon term for your character. It is the one that is inducted into the most Hall of Fame kind of moments, and most people reference as sort of the watershed moment of role-playing games, where now games actually have meaning to the player, not just a way to collect treasure and kill monsters.
Now, when coining the word avatar, is there a specific definition for that, or what does it specifically mean to you?
Yeah, well, in fact, actually, this shelf of the books here right behind me, a lot of those books are some of the virtue study that I was doing to craft this game. I was going like, when I started off on that game, I was going like, wow, if I'm going to make a game about being virtuous, well, what am I going to do? Am I going to write a story about the 10 Commandments? And I'm going like, no, that didn't really feel right. Am I going to go to the Buddhist philosophy about the fourfold path and that sort of thing? I'm going like, well, I don't think that quite sounds right either. So I said, I need to study moral philosophy to figure out what am I going to try to assert is the way to be a good person, in this game that I'm going to write. And I needed it to be reasonably, sincere, reasonably complete, reasonably bulletproof. So I got a library. I started reading every philosophical and religious text I could get my hands on. I mean, it didn't matter whether it was Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, didn't matter. I read them all. And I read tons of like Greek and Roman writings about utopian futures and things of this nature. And one of the things I found was this word avatar, which actually the place I found it was in Hindu scripts that were referring to gods like, say, Vishnu, the elephant god. When he would come down on earth in human form, he would take human form so that nobody would recognize that he was a god, and he could kind of mingle amongst the people, without being identified. And that was Vishnu's avatar, his manifestation as a human.
Okay.
And I said, okay, well, in my game, since I'm going to judge you, the Earth player, so if it's in your case Rusty, I'm going to say, Rusty, even though you have come to the world of Britannia to live, and in Britannia, you might be the big burly barbarian, whether or not you're a skinny little computer nerd on Earth, it's still you, right? You are still responsible for the deeds of that character. It's not your evil alter ego, it's you, right? So I didn't want people saying, I'm not me, I'm playing Conan the Barbarian, so I can be a thief. I was like, no, this is you in my world. And so that's why I thought the word avatar was appropriate, is because that was the manifestation of you in the new virtual world. So that's why I picked the word avatar. And obviously since Ultima 4, it's now become sort of the standard. Prior to Ultima 4, your character in the game was called your character. Now it's your avatar.
Now, in the business end of this, how beneficial was it to bring your brother on board with his business experience?
Essential. In fact, the reason I left the previous two companies is almost all these early companies were run by people more like me, in the sense of they were just people who had stumbled into it at a young age and weren't experts in business. And the result of that was that because they weren't experts in business, they did not manage those businesses very well, despite the amazing sales they had. And so both of those first two publishers I worked with basically went out of business, owing me a lot of money. And each time they went out of business, I would turn to my brother, who's older than me and was going to business school. I'd go to him and go like, Robert, can you help me kind of collect from these deadbeats? And so 2 out of 2 times he tried to help me, and 2 out of 2 times he failed. But then he said, Richard, why would you trust this to somebody else? He was just finishing up his second master's degree. He had one in engineering and one in business. And so he said, let me go into business with me. I at least know when money comes in, I'll make sure you get your cut first. So, and I was going, yeah, well, getting paid for what you sell is a better deal than I've ever had yet. So, so at the very, we may win, we may lose, but at least I know, I'll get paid for what was sold. And that's what started this business together. And it really worked amazingly well, because another thing it did is that, if you leave a developer to their, or at least many developers, including this developer, if you leave some developers to their own and with an open pocketbook and say, how much time do you need and how much money do you need to make this great game? Well, they would say, well, I'll take all the time and all the money. And Robert was always going like, well, that's nice, but here's when the bank account goes dry. And so you'd better finish before that date or we're out of business. And so he could put the boundaries around not just me, but other developers as we joined. He would say, look, I love you all. I can't do what you're doing. I can't even tell you if the game's a good game or not. That's for you guys to describe. But I'm just telling you the reality is we are on the clock. And this is the parameters that we must meet in order to stay in business. And so that worked out very, very well. And Origin grew very rapidly and actually became one of the top 10 companies in the industry within a few years of forming.
Yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful relationship because, as an artist, even myself, I just have my mind on that. And when it comes to the money and the finances, I rather juggle cobras than go to a board meeting, So I always need someone else to hang over me saying, hey.
Yeah, exactly. And I find I need that too. Fortunately, I also later in life, I've now married someone who's much better at finance than I am as well. And so that has saved me plenty of times to have the voice of reason nearby.
Yeah. Now, is Bill Budge a mentor of yours?
Absolutely. In fact, I would actually say Bill Budge was the mentor. I don't know if you remember his early work. Again, there's my Apple II. Actually, I wrote all those early things on here. This machine right there is the Apple II I wrote these things on. And when I first saw the Apple II, Bill is one of the few people who was doing work before me. To this day, I look at Bill Budge's early work on that Apple II, and I am stunned he could do it. There is no time in my career, up to now, that I could have done what Bill Budge did 30, 40 years ago on that machine. He was writing an assembly language and writing 3D stuff that included, showing a space shuttle going around in orbit and hiding the back plane while only showing the front pixels, and things that I'm just going like, wow, that is just mind-numbingly hard, even from not just the math, but also how to get that little machine with 1 megahertz to do this and do the visual occlusion and things that I'm to this day floored he could pull off. And and he was actually working at California Pacific, which was that first company that called me up to publish the first Calibeth and Ultima. And so when they called me up and said, hey, by the way, we're the publisher for Bill Budge, I'm going like, hallelujah. I've been called by, called home to, go to the best possible place there is, because that's because Bill Budge was there. And to this day, I don't hear from Bill very often, but I think we get an email, within the last year anyway. But he still does just amazing work that is inspirational.
Now, with the 3D technology that you pioneered in the early days, as well as multiplayer gaming, which still blows my mind. My son does it every day, and I'm like, where's this come from? Are they really stepping stones to what is being done today?
Oh, completely. And my kids are they're 6 and 8 as well. And so they're, of course, playing Roblox and Minecraft are like all they play.
Oh, yeah.
And what's really funny about it is, like, my daughter will come up and go like, "Oh, Papa, I just figured out there's something called a rare item," or Papa, I just figured out, I can actually buy one of these on eBay or Etsy. I can, back instead of having to work for months. And I'm going like, yeah, I know all this. I'm going to go like, yeah, we invented rare things back in Ultima Online. Back in Ultima Online, you could buy these. We begin to find virtual assets for sale on eBay. And so anytime my kids come up and go like, Dad, did you know this about multiplayer games? I'm like, yeah, I helped invent it. I know, I was there.
It reminds me of, his buddy Guy, the guitar player, the blues guitar player. His son said, "I want to learn the guitar. Who should I emulate? Who should I study?" He said, "Study Jimi Hendrix." And then he studied Jimi Hendrix and said, "Jimi Hendrix, who's your idol?" He said, "Buddy Guy." And the kid never knew.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, and so that's what I do find that kind of fun now too. Which, and by the way, there are areas where Roblox and Minecraft have made incredible innovations that have gone way beyond the early stuff that I helped build. But the foundation is clearly there. In this, and so even a lot of the terminology. Not only is the word MMO, or massively multiplayer online game, come from Ultima Online, but this one, only developers would know this one, which is that when we first started building Ultima Online, we were told that the lifetime sales, in fact, we had a hard time getting EA to let us start it because they didn't think it would ever sell. But they really did say that we can never imagine an online game selling more than 30,000 copies. And so based upon that was their maximum conceivable sales, we built a world that said, okay, if we sell 30,000 copies, maybe 10% of the people be online at once, that's 3,000. And so we need to build a physical world that can handle about 3,000 people kind of, hanging out somewhere in the world. And so we built Britannia, the map that would hold about 3,000 people. Well, then we put up the beta test, the first kind of really alpha test disc, and hundreds of thousands of people immediately paid to get the beta test. So 10 times more than they thought the lifetime sales were. And immediately the sales projections went from 30,000 to 3 million. And by the way, the real sales ended up being tens of millions. But immediately we thought, well, shit, we haven't built a world that's big enough to hold the people that are going to be there day one. And there's no way we could make the world 10 times bigger. And so we went, we're going to have to make 10 or more copies of the world for people to play in. And I was actually really disappointed by that fictionally, because I was going like, well, if you and I start in different servers, then we're not going to see each other, and our servers are going to evolve differently. And there's going to be friends spread out across the globe who are going to find themselves accidentally separated in ways that didn't mean to. And so I said, well, how can I fictionally fix this? And so what I did is I came up with a story based on Ultima I. I said, Mondane's gem of immortality was broken into pieces. And at that moment, a copy of the world was made into each of those individual shards of the gem. And so we called those server sets shards. And we had originally planned that you could collect the shards and try to reunite various maps back to each other and give people a way to come back to each other on different shards. And so we called these shards. Well, it turns out not only do all MMOs call their copies of their server shards, but so do entire other industries. Like, so if you are Google or anyone else, and you want to have a copy of the database in Europe and a copy of the database in the United States for quick lookup, but you want to synchronize them over time, you
Mhm.
call those two databases shards. And those people have no idea why they call them shards, but it really comes back to the gem of immortality from Ultima I.
That's great. Wow. You're a big Dungeons and Dragons fan, I've learned. Now, with all the games that we have today and the technology, all this actually really filling in the blanks that you would have playing Dungeons and Dragons, you feel that almost the imagination is kind of becoming obsolete for some?
Well, so what's interesting is let me tell you my sort of arc with D&D. So I was amongst the first group of youngsters who began to play D&D. And it wasn't just D&D we'd played, but there were 3 or 4 other games, Tunnels and Trolls, Arduin and Gamor, and a few other games of that same pen and paper games of that same period. And what was interesting about the earliest adopters is that we were all passionate storytellers,
Mhm.
and none of us cared about the rules. And so while we read all the rules, we didn't really use any of the rules. We would actually just sit down and I would just tell a story like, hey, you're going down the hallway. What do you do? Oh, you go left. Well, around the left corner is this. And if what you do is smart or funny or seems like it ought to work, I didn't bother rolling dice very often. It just worked because it was clever. If on the
Yeah.
other hand, you take too much time or you do something that doesn't make any sense to me, then guess what? It doesn't work. Didn't need to roll any dice really about it. It just didn't work.
Mhm.
And so what I find is that the earliest game masters were super creative storytellers.
Yeah.
But as the game became more popular, you ran out of super motivated storytellers, and it started becoming number crunching. And so then I would go back after I was in college. I'd go back to the high school groups I used to play with, and they'd sit there. Okay, well, I've got a +2 sword, and I've got initiative, and I'm standing on a rock over you that gives me a +1. Let me do all the math to figure out what the hit probability is. Roll some dice, miss. Okay, let's start the calculation over. And I'm going like, wow, that is not role playing. That is
Yeah.
number crunching, but that is not role playing. And so what's interesting is I actually think for a long time role playing games pen and paper role playing games got worse as computer games got better. But what's interesting is I think we sort of come full circle. Computer games now are still, in my mind, kind of stuck in the vast majority of them are let's run around and collect treasure and kill monsters and level up. It's a level grinding experience primarily. And then eventually, you can kill the big evil bad guy that's been waiting for you and doing nothing particularly bad, once you're powerful enough to take him out. And so I think the actual depth of story in computer games is mostly pretty thin still. And on the other hand, I think people have started streamlining and simplifying role-playing games, the pen and paper kind, and getting back to more of that just interactive conversation that people like to have. Pardon my little doggy here is wanting to say hi too. So
No problem.
I'm going to come give her a little pet here to keep her calm.
I'm an animal lover.
But but what's interesting is like I just ran another D&D game for my kids. So my kids are now coming of age and they've been playing the computer stuff. And I exposed them to just, one game of physical tabletop role-playing games. And they were like all over it. So their thing was great fun. Cool. And I talked to that with some of my computer gaming friends who all are going like, well, let's have a pen and paper game again. Which rules system do you use? And I'm going like, no, you don't get it. The answer is none. And the answer is it's a story. It's an interactive story. It's not, the dice rolling is not what is important about the experience. And so I still think, as much as I'm pleased with the general direction of pen and paper games, I still think there's some work to do to simplify them even more, you might say, to make them kind of where I would like to end up.
Do you believe that there's a ceiling with our modern games today to where they just can't look more realistic? I mean, right now they're becoming so realistic. Is there going to be a ceiling to where, that's just as realistic as we can make it? Or will there be the ability to make it almost hyper realistic?
No, I think it's going to be hyper real. I think there's no question it'll be hyper realistic. Here's something I see about I've been doing this for 40 some odd years. So here's kind of how I see the evolution has gone. Computers are always getting faster and more capable. the slope of how much power you have in the box that you generally have on your desk isn't smooth. There are moments where there seem to be big advancements, and then it stays relatively stable for a few years, and then there's another big advancement. And I'm going to use as markers for big advancement things like when I first bought that Apple II, there was only a cassette tape reader in it. There was no disk drive. So going from cassette tapes to a floppy disk was a big deal. Going to the 3.5-inch disk, was a big deal. It was about 10 times the storage. Going to a hard drive was 10 times more storage. Going to a 3D hardware was obviously a big deal. The emergence of the internet was a big deal, to be able to play online easily without having to do a dial-up payments. And you could argue that maybe VR or something's coming in soon as another, but let's use just these 5 that I think people would recognize. 5 out of 40 years, is every 8 years or so there's a big jump. Well, every time there's a big jump, the race is on to get a game out that takes advantage of that 10 times more memory or 10 times more speed or 10 times more 3D, whatever it is. And so the easiest game to get up that takes advantage of those is usually something easily described as a first-person shooter, right? So the first new first-person shooter that looks way better than any game before it sells a ton. But then to compete with that game, since you can't make it look better much, because these guys hopefully did a good job of making it look good for this new hardware, the game probably should get a little bit deeper. I'm gonna have character attributes, or I'm gonna have a story, or I'm gonna have med packs. And so you start with a simple first-person shooter, and it gets more and more story-based, more and more role-playing like, until the next big advancement. And the next big advancement, everybody goes back to play first-person shooter again. And so games are sort of stuck in this, because we're taking advantage of the hardware, we're chasing first-person shooters almost entirely. The majority of the money in games to this day is made, in the first-person shooter genre. And the times that becomes less true are times when the platform is more or less stable. And so I actually prefer the times when the platform is more and more stable, because I prefer the deeper games. I have long since gotten over okay, I get it. The next first-person shooter looks a lot better, but I've already had 8 times to appreciate a really great first-person shooter that looks better than it did before. I'm really looking for for telling me a story that means something to me as a human and as an individual, and how that relates to your question is that by having that stability, once we get to reality engines, once it's hyper real, once that's no longer the problem, when it's so realistic that when you double the machine's speed, it doesn't help make it visually better because it's already visually correct. Then that extra speed will be used to make the game deeper, which in my mind is a good thing.
For years, you've been an advocate for gamer authorship rights. Have you seen any progress through the years?
No, not really.
No?
In fact, the problem is, motivations are separated, and so it's. I'm not exactly sure what the solution to this is, but back when I got started, it was one person makes one game. It's obviously it's you, and your name was on the box. If you look at Electronic Arts, this is when the change happened. And when EA launched their first ad, which had a tagline of "We see farther," and included Bill Budge as one of the people on the ad, they took all their authors, Bill Budge and others, and took photographs of them and celebrated them, because those were the authors you knew as a game buyer, and I wanted to buy the next Bill Budge item. But pretty quickly, not only did it become teams that made the game, but also if you were Bill Budge, you could leave and go somewhere else. And if Electronic Arts had been marketing Bill Budge and he could leave, it meant that the value you were marketing just walked out the door. And so now you've got to find somebody new to promote. And so it said, look, we would rather, come up with, NFL baseball, or that doesn't make sense. John Madden football. That's a good. I was trying to make one up, but I missed my metaphor. But they found it was better to market the product and not the people, because you could control the product. Right. But but that has actually gotten now to the point where, I see things, there are a lot of companies that, a big game now takes usually 5 years to make. And that's so long from a marketing standpoint. The company will often start two, so that one of them comes out 2.5 years after the next. And that means the original vision for the creation can't really be on both of them. And in fact, usually the original creator is long since left, and they just have two random teams, often in different parts of the world, kind of building these sequels that become, in my mind, soulless might be overstated, but not having the original visioneer with them, I think there's something less about them over time. And but we haven't really gotten back to author rights. I have no rights to Ultima at the moment, as a case study. So it's unfortunate that IP can be so fully owned and buried by publishers compared to the original author's work.
Does the criticism of games promoting violence have any legs at all?
Complex question, but I'm a believer that there's no, just like we have for movies, I think it's appropriate to have ratings, where you say, this is not appropriate for a young child. I have watched my own children watch something violent on television, then go kick each other in the hallway just because they're keyed up about it. Yeah. But the science is also pretty clear that, kids watching, violence in movies or games does not make them pick up a gun and shoot each other. And so I actually think that as a parent, you do want to manage the content that your kids watch. But I do not believe we are breeding a generation of violence into our kids or ourselves by those games. And by the way, I think artistic expression by definition should be free speech. So I'm a big believer in that. But if you ask me, do I think, there's value beyond actionable fun in, say, Grand Theft Auto or something? Grand Theft Auto is a great fun experience for adults, but is it helping me grow as a human? Probably not. Does it might have some sexist metaphors that are probably a little out of date for today? Probably so. But again, it's somebody's art, and they have the rights to produce it, and we should have the right to label it and keep it away from kids. But I don't think we need to worry about that we are, that this is. I do not believe this is part of our gun culture problem we have as a country right now. To put a fine point on it, I think we really do have a violence and gun problem. I don't think computer games are a significant contributor to it.
And I agree with the control, because psychologically and even physically, it can affect them. Like, for instance, my son, prime case example, 12 years old, loves games. He was so excited that I was talking to you today, but I try to control it for him. And I asked him one day, I said, to have a balanced life, how many hours a day do you believe that you could play video games to where you would have a balanced life all across the board? And he said he thinks about 6 hours a day a game. I'm like, oh man, we got a long road.
My kids would probably get the same answer.
Yeah. So what advice would you give him? Because he says he wants to be a designer, but I told him probably playing 8 to 10 hours a day won't help that. As far as a gamer today, a young gamer today who would want to go into the world of design, what would be your advice?
Yeah, it's interesting because I've as a father, I have similar discussions with my kids. And so what's interesting about it is, first, let me take you through the bad advice, and then I'll get to my real advice. And again, your instinct is right on with this about playing a game. I can't tell you how many gamers I talk to, players I talk with, who go, hey, I really love first-person shooters or whatever it is. I play it, I'm a particular fan of, pick your first-person shooter. And I think I have the great idea for the next great first-person shooter based upon what I believe we could go well beyond this game that I love is. And I immediately go, you have already told me enough to guarantee me that what you're doing is not going to work. And the reason why is that if your worldview is based upon the one game you love, and iterations on top of that, that team, they finished that and already making their next game. They finished it before you started playing it. Yeah. And this is the kind of thing their team of 100 really experienced developers is also thinking about. And so you're chasing a moving target with a disadvantage. It's like running a sprint when you're, running a 100-yard sprint when you're 100 yards behind the starting line. Yeah. So you've already lost. The way you started the game, you've lost. And the first thing you have to do is just say, look, don't even come to me with a game design idea unless you have a much broader set of inspirations, not only from all games that have existed, but a deep lexicon of movies that you've studied, a deep lexicon of reading that you've read. You have to come to me with what is the profound change of the industry, the archetype that you want to change. Not I'm going to add some med factors and story. How are you going to fundamentally change the gameplay experience in a meaningful way? That's just the start. But then what you also better do is you have to have found your way into development independently, not just be a gamer. And so here's my specific advice for your kids and my kids. And the good news, I think, for both of us is that there are games now out like Roblox and Minecraft that I think are not only great games, but help people bridge the gap from being a pure consumer of the content to understanding what it is to be a creator of the content. And so I had this discussion with my daughter, who's 8, and we said, look, if you want me to let you play 6 hours, you can play for a couple hours, but then what you need to do is to get the Roblox studio and go build a level, which she's done. She's actually published a couple of levels now on her own. And so, and once she starts going like, okay, I get it. I see how there's art primitives that are made. They have these tags in that give them functionality, and you have to name them and you have to build it hierarchically. And you then, when you build them out, you run out of space in the geometry, and you put in too much stuff, the frame rate slows down. You have to see how all these pieces interconnect. And there are now at least some games where you can do both, where you can you can start out as a consumer and evolve towards being a creator. And then from that, once our kids have started creating their own levels, then you go, okay, well, now it's time to start doing the scripting language, and to actually write some of the attributes that go in those blocks or cubes or items. And then once they've done that, you go like, okay, well, now you need to build some of those 3D assets with Unity or whatever else. And then once you've done that, you say, okay, now it's time to start learning, to actually use a full, compiler and write your own code from scratch. And then once you've read the lexicon of books and taken your inspiration and can tell me how you're going to fundamentally change the genre, not just iterate, then I will support you in playing a lot and starting a new career.
You're in the Gaming Hall of Fame. You received a Lifetime Achievement Award in the industry. Where would you rank yourself as one of the influencers of this industry?
Ooh, that's tricky. I've seen some top 100 lists, and I think it's impossible to look at a ranked list and not kind of debate like, ooh, I'm better than that guy, or actually that guy's probably too low. They should be higher. I actually, at least when I look at those, I'm generally ranked somewhere between number 10 and number 20 in history of gaming of influence. And I actually think that's it. When I look at the list, it seems about right. There are clearly people more foundational than me. Some of the guys who did the original Atari and Nintendo work, have clearly been even more foundational. They're, around number 10 to around number 20, there's a lot of my contemporaries, people who wrote a lot of these very early systems that sort of have become the patterns for a lot of the modern gaming. And then below us, below that are people who've just, had runs of hits of great. Right. If I had to kind of sit back and this isn't exactly what you asked, but if I had to think about like who are some of the ones I particularly admire personally, in addition to Bill Budge, he's absolutely my mentor, but hasn't written games really in quite some time. But I'm a real admirer of people like Will Wright. And one of the reasons I'm such an admirer of his is the diversity of games that he's been able to create successfully. I sort of have a style that I know and understand and like. And as a creator, even more than as a player, I play a lot of other kinds. Like I play real-time strategy games a lot. I play some first-person shooters, but I don't really play very many role-playing games, which is the thing I enjoy writing. I can't really explain why, I just don't. but I couldn't imagine writing a first-person shooter or writing. Maybe I could write a real-time strategy a little bit, but at least I would enjoy it. But I don't know if I could do it well. But Will has, written, 5 different genres, all of them more than competently. And so I just really admire that sort of multifaceted talent that seems to go beyond my skill.
Are you still designing today or working more the exploration route?
Well, at this moment, it's exploration, but I tend to take a year or two off after each kind of major cycle of game companies, and so I've just sort of gotten my most recent game company, Portalarium, on cruise control with Stride of the Avatar and its sequels that are coming up, and so that's a good time for me to sort of take a little breather and go do some exploration. But I still have things like down in my workshop downstairs. I'm still working on like another phonetic language for games. It's a project I've been working on literally for years, and so there are still facets of the gaming that I still am working on very actively.
Do you have a dungeon down there too?
I do, actually.
You do?
Yeah, I do. Of course, absolutely. In fact,
I love that dungeon. I have a couple of fingers I got from museums in the Amazon. I was going to show you, but I didn't know if I freaked too many people out.
Oh,
so
excellent!
Check this out.
Excellent.
Like this is I preserved
this.
Oh,
very nice.
This is
very
a Bushmaster viper that I caught, and I went to extract the venom, and I went to release it, but the Amazon native that I guide in the Amazon, and he ended up killing it because it bit his dog and killed his dog. I felt bad, and so I ate it, but I was able to preserve the head.
Those fangs are monstrous.
Yeah. And it's probably hard to tell on here, but if you look close, she has 2 fangs on one side.
Oh yeah. Wow, you're right.
Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing.
9 feet long.
Well, but here's the other thing too, since you mentioned you guide down in the Amazon. So, I'm a devout believer. In fact, I wrote a book called Explore Create about how I think that if you're going to innovate in any field, and whether that's podcasts or computer games or car washing, you need to cast a wide net. You need to go, if you're going to make it the best car wash ever made, if all you think about is other car washes, you're going to miss the fact that there have been people doing dishwashers, or maybe the way they clean space shuttle parts or something is going to be an inspiration for how you might make a car wash. You got to really look around at things that are seemingly completely unconnected if you're going to really make a good innovation. And that includes exploring the real world that we live in. And I mean the jungles and space and under the ice and under the ocean. Yeah. All those places are great inspiration and great, often direct opportunity to think of something clever, like a 3-fang bushmaster that might end up being just the right bad guy you need in a certain situation.
Yeah, so really it's kind of a fluid transition in a way. Many would think gaming and exploration are 2 totally separate things, but it's a very fluid transition.
I believe it completely. I really do believe that they are deeply related.
What was your first experience when you walked out of the door to go on your first exploration? What was it?
Well, I don't even know when I can tell you my first memory of exploration, but I don't know if this was literally the first. But we did, when I was young, we did the classic family summer vacation where we took our station wagon, pulling a pop-up camper, and we went east across the United States, up into Canada, across to the west, back down, and then across back to Texas. Wow. And one of the first stops we did on that trip was we were in Arkansas, I think, Hot Springs, Arkansas, I think. And out by the hotel we were staying in was just like a dirt dumpy field place. But in the side of a dirt wall, there was a cave. And that was, at least to my knowledge, the first cave I'd ever seen. And it was big enough for me to kind of duck walk into, but it got dark really fast. And I went to the diner next door and I got matches out of the ashtrays when that used to exist. And I got like 8 packets of matches. And I went into that cave by myself, striking matches as I went in deeper and deeper. And it was in my mind's eye, it was giant. I have no idea how big it was, probably a little puddle, but a little tiny little closet, but it seemed really big. seemed really spooky, really magical. And I was smart enough not to use more than half my matches on the way in, and slowly used the rest of the matches to get my way back out. But that sort of that kind of magical moment of discovery really kind of set me up to want to go look again. What's behind that thicket of trees? What's behind, over that mountain? What's underneath that river, etc.
What was your experience like in the Amazon? That's close, aside from being a guide. My wife is a third generation shaman or Indian from the Amazon, so it's my whole life. So I'd like to get your take on it.
I've made one trip down the Amazon, went into Quito in Ecuador, drove up over the mountains and got into one tributary and came back on another tributary. And we took with us a local guide. And what was interesting about this local guide, when I met him in the town, the oil town from the pipelines that were being put through, he was dressed very Western and, modern, kind of guy, except that he didn't speak either English or Spanish. The person who was arranging my trip spoke Spanish and his native language, so he was our interpreter. But as soon as we got away from civilization, he changed out into more of his, the attire of his community, his local community, and took off, for example, his wristwatch. And then as I talked with the guide, he was going like, well, by the way, he doesn't even, the wristwatch is just for looks, so he fits in. He didn't know how to tell time on that watch. He uses decimal time based upon the position of the sun. And so immediately I became captivated with this person, and both what his beliefs were, how he lived his life, meeting his family in his village was phenomenal, and talking also about why he really felt compelled to not stand out when he was in a Western town, because he would be ridiculed and people would think less of him in some way. When in fact it was really the reverse, as you might imagine. The people in the town were being completely closed-minded and didn't have anywhere near the vast array of knowledge this gentleman did about the place we were, this environment that we were in. And so I really very much enjoyed my time with him.
Before you go, can you give it a quick synopsis on your experience with the International Space Station? That must just out of this one.
Of course. Well, I'm now the only person who's been explored the Earth pole to pole. So I've been on every continent and both poles quite a bit. I recently got back from the deep ocean, down in the Challenger Deep of the Mariana Trench. But I have to say, still, the one that beats them all hands down is getting a chance to travel above the Earth. The training for a space flight is frankly amazing. The fiery launch, is 8.5 minutes. That's unbelievable. The fiery reentry is similar to launch, is another amazing moment. But the best part by far is literally just sitting in a spacecraft orbiting the Earth, looking down at this magnificent planet at an orbital speed. That means you go around the Earth every 90 minutes. You see sunrise and sunset every 45 minutes. You cross whole continents in 20 minutes. But you're only 250 miles up, which is really not that far up. I mean, it's far enough to see the curvature of the Earth, but it's not so far away you miss out on the amazing detail. So it was great. We enjoyed it quite a bit.
So what's in the future?
Well, there's still tons of places to explore on the Earth. My next ones are in January. I'm going back down to Antarctica to look for Sir Ernest Shackleton's lost ship, the Endurance. In the summer after, we're hoping to get to the little island called Pitcairn, where the mutiny on the Bounty mutineers ended up, to go do some genetic research on some of the grave sites and things over there. And tons more to do.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to keep in touch with you, and all this new stuff that comes up, I'd love to talk to you again about.
Absolutely. Well,
Richard,
since we share the Da Vinci life, flag, I'm happy to come back anytime.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Richard. Keep up the good work, and fantastic talking to you, and we'll be in touch.
Likewise. Pleasure.
Thanks,
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.